Welcome back, everyone, to Vox Markets. My name is Paul Hill. I'm delighted again to be able to speak to Sara Barrington, CEO of Verici Dx, a next-generation immunodiagnostics firm specialising in the global kidney transplant market. So welcome, Sara.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be back.
Yeah, well, congratulations on the Clarava validation study results coming out this morning. So let's start there, shall we? Could you just quickly remind investors of the key benefits of the test for sort of like patients and clinicians, and also how simple it is and how easy it is actually to perform?
Yeah, Dr. Gallen always calls this the crystal ball test. It's one of the most difficult to do because effectively what it's doing is it's predicting a patient's likely immune response to the transplanted organ without knowing anything about the organ, without knowing anything about the compatibility. It's really patient focused, and as such, there's nothing like it.
Brilliant. And it's basically it's a blood draw, isn't it? And then you get to go back to your FDA approved lab to actually then do the actual analysis and gets turned around in a certain X days or so.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, from the clinician's perspective, it's very simple. It's a simple blood draw. Then they pop it in the courier system over to our Clear lab, not FDA, but Clear lab.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. The hard work happens there with the sequencing and the algorithms and everything. And then, but from the clinician's point of view, all they get back is a test result. So if they do a simple blood draw and then they get a test report back, and then they'll be able to, get the results within 5 days.
Brilliant. And then just, I mean, in terms of the actual, the problem that for the current sort of like, patient and also for the doctor, I mean, as I understand it, there's about 40% of sort of like organ transplants, kidney organ transplants that eventually are sort of rejected, isn't it? And is that the sort of the benefit of this sort of like, higher performance test and simple test to be able to then improve that matching process and importantly the treatment regime after they've received the graft?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between having a rejection event and an actual rejection. So anywhere, and the literature is quite varied, but anywhere up to half of all patients will have what they call a rejection event, and that requires management. If you think about it, transplant is not really a disease; it's a man-made situation where you're putting in an alien organ into the body, and the body is designed naturally to reject it. So that high rejection event is not surprising, even though they're already trying to treat it from the get-go. Only about just somewhere under 25 to 30% will fail. But still, what you're really looking about is that rejection event and what information the clinician has to be able to react and manage that process.
And it's quite an important time, isn't it? The first sort of month and a bit, or first 2 months after the actual operation. And that's where your sort of like the Clarava personalized sort of like test gives better information for the doctor to tailor that treatment regime.
That's completely right. In fact, the first couple of months has been completely underserved. And one of the things that we recognize is where a lot of rejections do happen, and that makes sense intuitively. So what Clarava does is right from the get-go, it gives the clinician the ability to know ahead of time, where are my high-risk patients, where are my low-risk patients. Now, with your high-risk patients, you're going to spend more time, more medication, just more. So, you know that you've got to be very proactive in their management. And then, of course, once you've got ahead of the story, which is the Clarava post-transplant, of course, we offer Tutivia, which is about, the post-transplant situation. And that can be picked up from as soon as anywhere from the first week post-transplant. So there's a really nice handoff between the two tests in terms of patient management.
Yeah. So that gives basically the doctors far more information, positive information that they then can react and tailor their that treatment. Yeah,
you want to be ahead of it. That's Clarava. You want to know what you're doing ahead of time, and obviously from hospitals perspective, that becomes very important in terms of managing their, readmissions and their quality metrics. But then, from the clinician's point of view, they know where their high-risk patients are, and then they'll be able to Tutivia is also picking up the kind of more global aspect post-transplant.
Good. And then just on the actual performance, the sort of accuracy, just in layman's terms, just for sort of like the sensitivity and the specificity of this particular Clarava test, can you just sort of like give a bit of color on that, how investors should have interpret those results?
Yeah, they're very good. Obviously, it's never going to be 100%. In fact, we'd be very suspicious if it was. And what the sensitivity is about the accuracy of the positive prediction, and the specificity is about the reaction of the negative. Clearly, in this space, clinicians are much more interested in the accuracy of the positive here. And that's why the the sensitivity was important. And I think that the other aspect to really understand here is what we might call balanced accuracy. So the measures were quite close together. It's you can have tests, and they are helpful if you want to really promote one aspect over the other. But this one was nice, and so far it's got sort of a nice balanced accuracy there. Let me talk about something that's perhaps even more significant to the clinician, which is what we call the odds ratio. And we have an odds ratio of 6. What does that mean? Well, if you get a high risk result, that patient is 6 times more likely to have a rejection event than the patient that is returning a low risk. So that differential is really something that is clearly actionable for the clinician. So they're going to see a high risk, they're going to take actions accordingly. Now, that may well be keeping them in hospital later, or expecting them back, or closely managing them. They're certainly going to monitor them very closely. It could be adding in, other therapeutics. Steroids are used in high-risk situation. They may increase the dosing of the immunosuppressant regime. At the moment, a lot of hospitals will say, "Oh, we have a one-size-fits-all protocol for our dosing." Now you're having that differential. So if you've got a high risk, you're probably going to do more of everything: time, focus, medication. And if you've got a low risk patient, then you have a little bit more confidence in this on what are standard protocols, which are, essentially you give a high dose at the beginning and then you taper off. And both patient and clinician can have a little bit more confidence in that protocol, which is also as important as knowing where your high risk patients are.
And then in terms of sort of like getting approval for the actual reimbursement for from Medicare, etc., what's sort of like the timeline for that? I saw we've got a provisional sort of green light anyway.
Yeah, that's great. So there are 2 aspects. One is a regulatory approval, and that people often ask me if we're going to go to FDA. We are not. We are already regulated within the clear environment, and so when I say that we can do our commercial launch before the end of the year, that's what I mean. We can put it through our clear lab, and it's offered to clinicians. So that's your regulatory. Then there's the reimbursement, and that's Medicare. And as you know, we already got a code for Clarava, and we've got a provisional price that's still subject to public comment and review. That doesn't get finalized to the end of the year, but the majority recommendation was for a price point of $2,650. Which was what we had asked for. So I think that that's very encouraging on price. And then you go through approvals. Now, the interesting thing for us on Clarava is that there's a couple of ways to commercially launch this. One is straight to the hospitals, where the Medicare reimbursement is not as significant, because it's basically a hospital-based reimbursement there. And that was the importance of recognizing 2 different, transplant populations. So the deceased donor, that's going to be done just before the, if you like, the operation, the surgery, and that gets bundled up. That's a hospital sale, right? living donors are likely to be done outside of that time window and therefore likely to go through the Medicare reimbursement route. The hospitals will look at the Medicare price, so the pricing is always important to go down, but using these as two different populations is incredibly helpful commercially in terms of understanding that there are two routes to market for us, and being able to distinguish is going to be very helpful.
Good. And so putting that together, what sort of like sort of total addressable market are we talking of for well, basically for Clarava and for Tutivia?
Yeah, I mean, what we did previously is we looked at it over a 5-year period, and it's basically 1.5 billion for Clarava and 2.5 billion. So let me break that down. If I look at just this current iteration of the test in Clarava, I would say that the addressable market's about 200 million annually.
Mm. Right, brilliant. Okay, so so pretty sizable to say the least.
There's enough there to get a revenue line, right?
Yeah, I know. I mean, how close is the competition? I mean, I'm just sort of like, this is such a breakthrough improvement in sort of like, treatment for transplant patients, kidney transplant patients. What sort of like, indicative market share would something like this sort of like ultimately aim to get? Because it will still be improved, because you do this AI thing, don't you, as well, with regards to the accuracy?
Yeah, there are no competitors. So that makes that addressable market, ours to address. We're not sharing it with anybody else. So I think that's very encouraging. It is unique. No one else has done this. There are pre-transplant tests in terms of, compatibility between the organ and the patient, but none really looking at one of the main drivers in the early stage, which is the patient immune response. So no competitors or addressable market. We're hoping for a first offering, first mover advantage in that penetration, in the take up. Yeah.
Good. I'll just highlight to investors to have a look at the Singer's note. I mean, I'm looking at the one which was done early in June, and it shows a significant ramp up of sales. They reckon that we're going to hit for Tutivia around about $4.5 million for 2024 in sales, and 1.6 in Clarava. So, but that's ramping up significantly from a total of about 0.7 and 0.1 for this year. So yeah, significant growth opportunity at high margins, I imagine, as well, isn't it? Sort of like from that, because obviously you've done all that, the R&D costs.
Totally, yes. Sequencing is still expensive, although we're seeing quite a rapid decrease in the cost of sequencing, even over and above what they've managed to achieve now. It is labor intensive in terms of time, so it's 4 days in the lab, but beyond that it's relatively straightforward. And we do see a high margin, and something that obviously with volume over time, you improve that margin because you get the economies of scale.
Good. And how would you anticipate sort of this, if it goes well, obviously the commercialization, which certainly seems to be the case, sort of like, in the US, how would you sort of like then transfer it overseas in terms of maybe the Asia, but particularly in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, what you have in Europe is obviously you have data protection rules you have to, really look at. So data needs to keep within the national boundaries, also for market access, and they're all different, regimes in terms of how you get something into each country's health system. But beyond that, there is an ability to, you've got two choices really. One is to offer in a lab-based offering, or one is to distill it down to a kit, and we would explore both. Good.
And just obviously, I don't want to know anything sort of price sensitive or anything, but just the sort of initial feedback from Tutivia, from the sort of hospitals and the clinicians, etc., just from having a first look at it in terms of, because obviously it's been on the market for a few months now.
It's been very favourable, actually, and different aspects of Tutivia have appealed to different clinicians. The early story is quite compelling, I think, across the board. you know, the ability to have something that's very highly performing in that first 60 to 90 days, you know, is something that clinicians have focused in on. I think that that's, you know, it plays very nicely with Clarava as well. Obviously, you know, it goes out anywhere into the first year, but I think the appeal of an early biomarker being able to get ahead of the story. Again, we issue a risk score for Tutivia, and so this is the idea: is can you get ahead of something that's happening? Or are you, you know, with cell-free DNA, are you behind the curve? Are you only measuring injury once it's happened? So that's that shift in the clinicians able to be proactive rather than reactive has been favorably received. You know, the clinical trial design has been attractive, and also the implications of a risk score. So traditionally, this is what we mean by personalized. You know, traditionally there have been very broad factors in terms of a risk. One of them, for example, is that generally speaking, African American patients are seen to be, you know, high risk. They have a sort of certain genetic component that, or mutation that is, you know, has put them traditionally at high risk in this area. One of the things that we've been able to show is that now you can bring it down to the individual patient, so you don't have to use that broadband. And one of our clinicians is particularly excited about making that differential. So, you know, different aspects. You know, when we look at Tutivia, it's the early, the personalized, the dynamic ability, and of course, one of the things everyone's watching with interest and waiting for, you know, increased data on is the monitoring. So being able to you know, do a clinical action, for example, changing the dosing, and being able to measure very quickly the change in the patient condition is of great interest, and we're being watched quite closely on that.
And I'm guessing, I mean, again, just as a layman, if you do these sort of two tests, the more samples you get and the more tests you've done, the more accurate with the AI layer, the more accurate the profile in the RNA, and the more sort of like different sort of like, you know, sort of profiles that you see. So presumably that will improve the whole sort of like, you know, that differentiation between high risk and low risk and accuracy, I imagine.
Yeah, it's not out of clinical patients because we don't have the complete data set there. We just have, you know, what we produce as a result. But it was the design of our clinical trial. So if you remember that we, you know, we had 3 products going through because we want to look at the interaction. We stopped enrollment at 533 patients. Now, if you think about Tutivia, we only used 151 of those for the first iteration. That means we have many more patients to modify and to learn as we go along. If you remember, you know, the scary thing about AI is that sort of real-time, you know, learning that's going on, you know, for example, in the finance world or, you know, in consumer worlds, but you can't do that in healthcare. I always say it's a bit like a software upgrade. You get to do your learning somewhere else, you test it, you make sure it's safe and it's proper and it's, you know, giving you the results that you need, and then you introduce it to the market. You're not doing continuous learning on patients. That would be highly unethical.
Okay, fine, good. Okay, well, brilliant. Well, massive congrats again, and you've obviously got a very exciting second half and 2024 as well. Just in terms of sort of like news flow going forward, what sort of like do you think investors sort of look forward to?
You always want more.
Sorry about that. I'm a pain, I know.
Yeah, we're waiting to announce our publication on Tutivia. I'm excited to be able to press release on that. There'll be, you know, commercial milestones on the reimbursement side. There'll be, you know, further product developments. You know, we have a wealth of data here, and you know, that's very good for collaborations. And it's also very good for bringing out aspects of our products that we, you know, that we can test. So there is always more, but I think for the here and now, I'm just going to sit there and congratulate my team on an excellent result for Clarava.
Yeah, no, they definitely need a big pat on the back. Now, last time I asked you that painful question, you said you talked about sort of like strategic optionality as well, but we'll leave it there for another time. So thanks very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.